requires that reflective thinking. So as teachers complete this, the student teachers, they're going to find that they are become better and better at those TPA entries that they have to produce at the end of student teaching. For every lesson that is observed, this has to be used. For every time there's an TPA lesson, this has to be used. And it really should be given to you, mentor teachers, 24 to 48 hours in advance, right? I know that as a supervisor, when I would go to observe students, I would like to have that early so that I can read. I've got in my mind what the student has intended to do. Then I watch the performance to see if they actually did it. Did they get through it? Did they get through part of it? Did they rush through it just to say I'm done, but then to find out to have the students know what they said? Those kinds of things. So for every observed lesson that you'll do and every observed lesson the supervisor will do, they will have a lesson plan format for that. The DICE form is the actual rubric that we use to gauge student effectiveness, candidate effectiveness in the classroom. So that's the tool you're going to be using, and it consists of summary sheets and it consists of the rubrics. And there'll be a training video later on for these DICE forms to kind of help you get into it a little bit more. But just understand that they're broken down this way to tease out lots of things. The DICE form measures several things. First of all, the dispositions. Do student teachers have the right stuff to be a teacher? We're going to cover that in a second. The instructional pieces. What is it in a classroom that students must know and be able to do to be a successful teacher? And then content-specific part. Sometimes there are some extra things that you have to do as a teacher of science or a teacher of math or an art teacher or a music teacher that's not covered by the generalized standards, but they're more content specific. So there's always a part of that. And so those three things make up that DICE form. So what are you measuring at disposition? So we know there are certain professional behaviors that if students have those, if candidates have those, if teachers have those, they're likely to be more successful, right? So things such as, are they a strong communicator? Do they take criticism well? Do they establish a good rapport with students, colleagues, supervisors, other people in the building? Are they enthusiastic about what they're doing? Ethical, certainly. Do they value and believe in others? Like others can learn. Do they persist? And certainly we'll be measuring a lot of persistent student teacher this semester, I think. Persistent in everything you do and ways of thinking about things differently. Cooperating if they're mature, if they take responsibility, if they're showing initiative, and if they're confident. So these are the dispositions that we'll measure each time the student performs and throughout their entire time with you. And there's a rubric that has certain language, and we just want you to continue to go back to those rubrics and look at that language and gauge their effectiveness based on that rubric. Remember, this is a growing process, so we wouldn't expect scores to be too high, although in some of these, we've got some pretty great student teachers, so you might see some pretty high scores right away. But the idea is that if I am deficient in certain areas, I will know what to do to improve myself. That's what we want to use the DICE for, that it's evaluative, but it's also instructive at the same time. So part one of the DICE form are dispositions. And that's rated on a scale of 1 to 3. The instructional part is the second part of the DICE form. So when we measure this second part, we're really looking at where the rubber meets the road, right? The skills, techniques, structures, all those things that we know students, candidates need to have under their belt to be an effective educator. So these are the components that I think if you look at them carefully, they're not going to be much different than the OTAS that you have had before and used for your evaluation. So, do their lesson plan show focus for learning? Have they considered assessment data as they've done the planning? What other content, knowledge, sequence, or connections can they bring into the lesson that has already been covered? Do they know their students and their backgrounds? The lesson delivery, of course, how well they actually deliver the lessons from their lesson plans. Differentiation, are they aware of all the students in your classroom and all of the needs? They'll use information that you give them to help them with that eventually, and as they continue to work with students, they'll discover the other things they might need to consider when differentiating their instruction. What kind of resources are they using? Now, my goodness, when I'm thinking about using resources, if this isn't hitting the mother load of using resources to make your point teaching, I don't think I can think of no other kind of situation. So many technical things. The trick will be how well do they use that to the student's benefit. Classroom environment, my goodness, I don't think I've thought too much about how do you start a community of learners in a classroom environment that may be remote or virtual. We don't know. It'll be interesting to see the different structures. We know there are certain things out there that we can do. Again, making sure that we connect with the K-12 students often, making sure that they feel supported and appreciated like any of us, right? That is probably a key to it as well. But there'll probably be some other things we discover along the lines as we do this together. So the assessment of student learning. So what were the results of what I did with those students? Did I make inroads with them? Did they understand? Sometimes it's more about what it tells me about my teaching. What didn't I cover? They missed this completely. Goodness, what am I going to do with this? How am I going to cover this material so that students really get it? So that's part of it as well. And then professional responsibilities, those connections, those things that we do to better ourselves as educators, as we've talked about before, being lifelong learners. So those are the components that are in the DICE form. I can't imagine it's different than what you've already seen in OTES. And so that should help you a little bit as you look at that particular part of DICE. That's rated on a 0 to 4 scale. And when you look at those rubrics, and once you see the training video that we'll prepare for you, I hope it'll make sense. We can always do a meeting if we need to discuss it further. The third part of the DICE form is content specific. So there's those instructional skills, techniques, structures, behaviors that are identified with a certain content area. For example, as an example, science. One of the big pieces of that is safety, and safety in the classroom. I don't necessarily think I think too much about that language arts, but when you're dealing with substances and beakers and measuring tools, that's one part of science. In mathematics as well, as we use math manipulatives, they are not treats to be eaten. We have to learn how to use our manipulatives before we move on to learning, right? So there are certain things that the content specific piece will measure. Some of it's already been included in the instructional in that second part, but where there might be a missing gap or so, based on what these professional associations tell us, that'll be what it'll be in the DICE form. So that'll look different for each licensure area, whether it's math, science, early childhood, special ed. But it'll be part of the DICE form that you'll use to evaluate your student. It's also rated on a 0 to 4 scale. Lots of print here. I include it only so that you'll have a record of it and you can read it at another time. But what we want you to encourage you to do, in a nutshell, is to use the rubric language that's included in those forms to document what the student does. We're not taking all these, we're looking at the rubric, we're giving a score. We're not taking the scores and averaging them out. It's not an average. It's what the preponderance of evidence tells us over time. So if we have students who have started out what we think is a 2 level, which would be a developing, and then as they get better into 3s, now they may have equal 2s and 3s, but from what you've seen, if you think they're on the right track, you will give the 3 because they're there, right? It's not an average. So again, we'll cover that in the training video about the DICE form. But what's really important to remember is that the DICE form is one document. People like to separate them out because of the rubrics with all the numbers, and then there's the summary sheet where you have to put what numbers you have on it for a final score. And people sometimes just give me the summary sheet without the rubric. We need both. We need both of them. We need your scores, but we need what evidence you used from the rubric to justify the score, because that's how the student gets better, right? If they can see what they missed on the rubric, they can account for that and then better themselves in the next performance. So you'll complete a DICE form all by yourself with your 3 observations. The supervisor will also do theirs, and we'll take those scores and then we will put those together. But for your purpose and your scoring of student performance, you're going to just preponderance of evidence that you see, and the growth. You're going to give credit for growth over time. You know, when the student walked in, they could barely do this, and now, oh my goodness, they're so good at this now. Then, you know, based on the scores you've given, which should have gotten better, you can give a final score based on what the rubric says. So again, there will be a video and a PowerPoint. It's not done yet because we had one already done, but we changed the form. So I want to make sure that you get the right training on it. It'll be specific on how to use that DICE form as evaluation, but of course also as a coaching tool. I would always look at that DICE form and I would look at the rubric and I would sit with my student teacher and I'd say, I could see where you did this and this in this performance, but you just missed out at this level because you didn't do this. And so the note that they make on their reflection log is that, oh, I need to make sure I do more of this so I can get better with my performance. So the link will be sent to you for that video. It'll be sent via email to you, and then you can look at that. And there's also then a quick 2-minute survey asking you about the video. Was it helpful to you that you did indeed see it? It's entirely, I know I'm not a great person in the world to look at all the time, but you know, I do try my best. I'm using what God gave me. So we'll make sure that it's worth your while. And then if you'll just fill that out, that'll let us know that you have indeed satisfied that particular part of it. I think you'll find it worthwhile. And then if any questions result from that, certainly send those to me and I'll be glad to go ahead and talk to you about that. There, for every observation that you do, you should talk with your student teacher and review the scores that they got. They should have in front of them a reflection log. And it's something that student teachers will have, the candidates themselves have to do. And basically it'll record what they hear you say about what strengths is that you saw, what weaknesses, what things they need to change, and what their next steps are going to be. It's kind of getting that feedback. As we well know, research tells us the feedback that is given as soon as a performance is done is really, really effective. So the student teacher fills out the reflection log to process what you've heard, what they've heard from you. And so for every observation, there should be an entry log form filled in for that particular performance. And then eventually the student teachers will submit that to me along with your DICE forms for their placement. Another form that you have in your packet is a professional performance report. And it does not have to be completed at all.